Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. As the IRS begins the 2025 tax filing season, it is dealing with the impact of some of President Trump's executive orders. Joining me to discuss how those orders are affecting the IRS and questions that she is receiving from companies is Nikole Flax. Nikole, welcome.
Thank you.
So we have these executive orders come out, and they were pretty significant. One has to do with hiring freeze and then the regulatory freeze, which I know a lot of people have questions about. And we had a conversation with you last week, and I feel like we're going to be continuing to have conversations with you as things evolve. And I want to point out that I'm not clairvoyant. The points that we're going to talk about today, you have given us. These are questions that you have received. So why don't we go ahead and get through them? So the hiring freeze is a big one, and personnel retention has been a big issue for the IRS. So what can we expect in the coming months?
Sure. So all federal agencies obviously have been impacted by the executive orders. The IRS in particular, though, has been called out, and I think will have a more significant impact. And that clearly has a direct impact on those that are specifically addressed in the orders, but also just general employee morale. And it also impacts future hiring as you have professionals who think about whether they want to go to government eventually. So with respect to the hiring freeze, for other agencies, it's a 90-day freeze. For the IRS freeze, it's indefinite, and the standard is it has to be determined that it's in the national interest to lift the freeze. I think the assumption is it will vary depending on the type of employee with respect to how long the freeze stays in place. Also, OPM has issued a memo to all agencies to identify employees who are in their probationary period. And if you're in your probationary period, there are less protections in place.
Okay.
And with the IRS, because they have had significant hiring over the last year, that will impact them more because they have more employees in a probationary period.
And all this during the kickoff of filing season, which busy time. It's a very busy time. So let's turn to returning to the office. I know this has been a really big issue for people. And I will just comment that I take the Metro into work here in DC, and it has been packed since last week. So how is that all going to play out?
Sure. So for the IRS, obviously, like with other agencies, employees are being asked to come back. As I think I mentioned last week, the majority of the IRS workforce is unionized, and they're subject to a collective bargaining agreement. So those legal issues will have to be worked out. There are also issues with respect to space, as the IRS has been working to save government resources over the last many years, whether in some cities there's adequate space to come back. But the distinction with the IRS that doesn't exist for other agencies is historically, for business audits, IRS employees would go to the taxpayer sites and work there. And that changed a bit after COVID, both because there was more flexibility on the IRS side, and then also some taxpayers are not interested in having the IRS at their places of business where they didn't have as many employees. We've started to see a bit of a return to that. We have opening conferences where IRS is coming out to place of business, where they are doing tours. And so I think that will be an open question with respect to whether they'll try to do that and start working at taxpayer sites more again.
And of course, the taxpayer sites have changed as well, because we've all learned to work differently.
Right.
Okay. And another question that you've been getting has to do with guidance that was issued prior to the executive order on the regulatory freeze. So what happens? There were notices that came out. So what happens to the guidance that was issued prior to the executive orders?
Sure. Well, there's a few buckets of guidance, and I think things are still a little unclear with respect to some of those. So the executive order clearly contemplates that, there was a halt, and as things were getting sent to formal publication, those should get pulled back. They should not be published. There are a number of pieces of IRS guidance that were posted publicly, but were not officially published through the government means. And so they are not fully effective if they don't go through the formal process. But it is interesting that you have this limbo with those pieces of guidance. Obviously, there were a significant number of guidance projects that went out before the executive order, and those can be subject, to recall through the congressional process. But, I think last time we saw there wasn't a ton of that, and expect, most of those policies to potentially be revisited, but taxpayers are relying on that, at least as of now. And then there's just really a freeze right now for anything new to come for a while.
And what is the time period for the freeze?
I think it's unclear. And as I've talked to IRS and raising questions, It seems like the freeze right now, they are figuring out exactly how it's going to work. So I think even things like we're not going to see a bunch of FAQs, even informal guidance that would normally come out, as there's just sensitivity to not having any policy calls made while the political process is working to get the heads of offices set.
Okay. So let's turn to the Inflation Reduction Act. There are disbursements that the government needs to make. And I want to ask about the energy credits and how that is going to work right now.
Sure. So we've gotten a number of questions whether the executive order related to IRS funding impacts payment of the energy tax credits that the IRS would be making. And our read of it is no. So it does limit distribution of IRA funds, but the IRA funds are not what are being used to pay tax credits to businesses that file them through their returns. So we expect those to continue to be processed. Obviously the interest in having those incentives be successful is different now. And so that will be something to watch as we move forward. But the IRS does work to implement the law that's in place. And there are a significant number of filings that went in, around October of 24, and businesses are waiting for their credits and would expect that they continue to be paid.
All right. And then enforcement, how does all of this action, the announcements, how does that affect enforcement at the IRS?
So obviously a big open question, there's talk about that the additional enforcement funding will be rescinded, and, all the talk about hiring, and enforcement is really driven by people at the IRS. So as hiring declines, enforcement declines. I think in terms of immediate steps, what we've seen already is just in the last administration, there were public announcements every few weeks about the focus on large business enforcement, what issues they were focused on. I think things will be quiet for a while as it settles out a bit and the priorities are identified. I think with respect to existing open cases, those will continue. The career employees, they're not going to pivot away from the work that they're doing, but some of the public announcements they'll just go quiet until things settle out and it's clear what the priorities are.
Okay. And Scott Bessent was confirmed as Treasury Secretary, and we are still awaiting an IRS commissioner. What is happening with Billy Long's confirmation?
So he was formally nominated on the 20th. And so the process is beginning. As we all see, there are priorities in terms of how things move. And so everyone is waiting to see how that will shake out. It's also important to know the way that the IRS commissioner term works. He steps into the remaining term of Danny Werfel's 5-year term. So if he is confirmed, he would be IRS commissioner through November of 2027. So it's just an interesting timing how that works out.
Okay. Actually, one more question for you. So I know people are calling you with questions. Are people able to get through to the IRS?
I think so. I mean, the IRS has done, with respect to general taxpayer questions, they've done a really good job in staffing the phone lines. And we've been hearing, like this week in particular, that you can get in the phone lines and get your questions answered. I think with respect to the career employees, they are, they're really motivated to keep things moving in a transition period. And so I think the communication is at its normal level. It's the big policy calls that have to be paused for a while.
All right, Nikole, thank you so much.
Sure, thanks.
I know we'll be talking again. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
There are more episodes on the impact of President Trump's executive orders on the IRS and other tax matters, and you can find those on our website or in the description of this episode, which also includes a link to PwC's 2025 Tax Policy Outlook. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Take care.